The August heat pressed down on Eleanor's shoulders like a wet quilt as she stepped out of her rusted Chevy. The law office of Bartlett and Sons looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago when she'd signed her marriage certificate in the very same building. Lord, how time slips away like creek water through fingers. She tugged at her black dress, the only decent one she owned, and wished she'd had time to mend that loose button on the sleeve. "You're late," Martha Blackwood hissed from the doorway, her vulture-like frame blocking the entrance. The woman had hated Eleanor from the moment her precious son had brought home that trashy Jenkins girl from the other side of Oak Ridge County. Eleanor swallowed hard. Traffic on Miller's Bridge? A lie. She'd spent 30 minutes in her car crying, dreading this moment. The inside of Bartlett and Sons smelled like old papers and that fancy furniture polish Martha probably used in her own home. Everyone was already seated. Martha's two sisters with their pinched faces, Eleanor's brother Luke, bless him for coming, and old Mr. Bartlett himself, looking ancient as the hills but sharp as a tack. "Now that we're all present," Mr. Bartlett began, adjusting his glasses which seemed too modern for his weathered face, "we can proceed with the reading of James Blackwood's last will and testament." But first, Eleanor noticed a framed photo of James on the credenza, taken 3 summers ago at the lake house. His smile never quite reached his eyes those last few years. She wondered if anyone else had noticed. The cancer had been eating at him even then, she reckoned, though they wouldn't get the diagnosis for another 18 months. "As executor of this estate," Mr. Bartlett continued, clearing his throat with a sound like gravel under tires, "I'm obligated to follow the deceased's instructions to the letter." Martha straightened in her chair, hands folded primly in her lap, the picture of a grieving mother. Eleanor nearly snorted. That woman had controlled every aspect of James's life, even after they married, even after the children were born, even after everything fell apart. "The main residence at 457 Maple Street, along with all furnishings contained therein," Mr. Bartlett read through his spectacles, "and the sum of $853,000 in combined assets and accounts." Martha's thin lips curved upward, her eyes flicking toward Eleanor with undisguised triumph. "Are bequeathed to Eleanor Jenkins Blackwood." The room went quiet as a tomb. Eleanor blinked, certain she'd misheard. "That's impossible!" Martha's voice cracked like summer lightning. He couldn't. "The will is quite clear, Mrs. Blackwood," Mr. Bartlett said, unruffled as a pond on a windless day. "Your son made these changes 3 months before his passing." Eleanor's mind reeled like a fishing line with something too heavy on the end. She and James had been separated for nearly 2 years, living in different worlds, different houses, different lives. The divorce papers sat unsigned in her desk drawer. Neither of them had been in any hurry. His sickness had changed everything and nothing all at once. "This is her doing," Martha spat, pointing a bony finger at Eleanor. "She manipulated him while he was sick, took advantage." "Now hold on just 1 hot minute," Luke interrupted, his weathered farmer's hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "My sister was taking care of your son when you were too busy with your garden club meetings to drive him to chemo." Martha's face flushed crimson. "How dare you? I was there every day." "For an hour, maybe 2, Eleanor said quietly. The room fell silent again. "Then you'd go home because the smell made you ill." "I was the one emptying his bedpans at 3 a.m., Martha." Mr. Bartlett cleared his throat again. "There is more to the will, if I may continue." And just like that, the tension in the room twisted tighter than a tornado funnel. "To my mother, Martha Elaine Blackwood," Mr. Bartlett read. "I leave the summer property at Lake Whispering Pines and the sum of $200,000. Martha's face remained sour as green persimmons, but she nodded stiffly. "Additionally," Mr. Bartlett continued, "there is a personal letter addressed to Martha Blackwood, with instructions that it be read here today, in the presence of all parties." Martha's hands shook as she accepted the sealed envelope. Eleanor watched her mother-in-law's eyes scan the page, her expression shifting from anger to confusion to something Eleanor had never seen before on that proud face. Shame. "Read it aloud," Mr. Bartlett instructed gently. Those were James's wishes. Martha cleared her throat and began reading in a voice thin as tissue paper. "Mother, I write this knowing I won't be around much longer. The doctors say 3 months, but I can feel the truth in my bones. It'll be sooner. Before I go, there are things that need saying. First, I love you. Always have, always will. But loving someone doesn't mean you don't see their flaws. And Mother, your greatest flaw was never believing anyone was good enough for your only son. Especially not Eleanor. Martha's voice wavered. She looked up, her eyes meeting Eleanor's for a brief moment before continuing. You never gave her a fair chance. From day one, you decided she wasn't worthy because her daddy worked at the paper mill and her mama served lunch at the elementary school. You called her common behind her back. Yes, I heard you. And made her feel like an intruder in our home. What you never understood was that Eleanor saved me. Before I met her, I was drowning in expectations. Yours, Dad's before he passed. The family legacy. I was miserable, Mother. Contemplating things no son should ever tell his mama about. The room grew still as a February midnight. Even the ancient ceiling fan seemed to pause its creaking. Eleanor taught me to laugh again. To see beauty in simple things. To live without permission. For 10 years, we were happy. Properly, genuinely happy. Despite your constant disapproval. And then I made the biggest mistake of my life. I listened to you. I let you convince me that the Blackwood name needed to be protected when that business deal went south. I took your advice instead of Eleanor's, and it cost me my marriage, my integrity, and ultimately, her respect. Martha's voice cracked, her manicured fingernails digging into the paper. Yet she read on, each word seeming to scrape her throat raw. Eleanor never left me, Mother. Even after we separated when I got sick, she was there. Not for show or duty like some people. Martha's voice hitched, but she continued. But because despite everything, she loved me. Still loves me, I think, in her way. I'm leaving her the house and the bulk of my estate because she earned it. Not just by caring for me at the end, but by being the heart of our family for years while I was too blind to see what really mattered. And to you, Mother, I leave something even more valuable, the truth. I know about the letters. Eleanor's head snapped up. What letters? The ones Eleanor wrote me during our separation that never reached me. The ones you intercepted and kept in that blue box in your sewing room. I found them 3 weeks ago when I was looking for Dad's old cufflinks. 27 letters, Mother. 27 chances for reconciliation that you stole from us. Martha's hands were shaking so badly now that Mr. Bartlett gently took the letter from her. Shall I continue? He asked. Martha nodded mutely, tears tracking unheeded down her powdered cheeks. I've read them all now, Mr. Bartlett read from James's letter. In them, I discovered that Eleanor never wanted a divorce. She wanted counseling, a fresh start. She told me about the baby she lost, our baby, while I was away on that business trip to Chicago. A miscarriage she suffered alone because you told her not to bother me with such things while I was working. Eleanor closed her eyes. The memory of that day, the cramping, the blood, the devastating loneliness, washed over her like a flash flood. She'd written to James, poured her heart out, begging him to come home. He never responded. Now she knew why. Martha made a sound like a wounded animal. I never. What I'm leaving you, Mother, Mr. Bartlett continued reading, is the knowledge of what your interference cost us both. Years we can't get back. A child we never mourned together. A marriage that might have healed. I forgive you. That's what people do when they're dying. They find ways to make peace. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You'll have to find your own way to make things right with Eleanor, if that's even possible now. The blue box is in my personal effects. Mr. Bartlett has instructions to give it to Eleanor after this reading. The room felt like it was spinning, gravity shifting like those teacup rides at the county fair. Eleanor clutched the edge of her chair, remembering how she'd checked the mailbox every day for months, hope dwindling like daylight in December. Mr. Bartlett carefully folded the letter and handed it back to Martha, whose face had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. There's one more item, he said, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a small wooden box, hand-carved with wildflowers around the edges. James had made it for Eleanor on their 5th anniversary, back when he still worked with his hands on weekends, creating things just to see her smile. This contains personal items James wanted you to have, Eleanor, Mr. Bartlett said, passing it across the desk. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside lay James's grandfather's pocket watch, the one Martha had always insisted would stay in the Blackwood family line. Beneath it was a small velvet pouch containing Eleanor's original engagement ring. The simple one James had given her before Martha had insisted on upgrading it to something more suitable. And at the bottom, a folded piece of paper. Eleanor unfolded it slowly, recognizing James's handwriting, steady despite the disease ravaging his body. "My dearest Ellie," it read, using the nickname only he had ever called her. "If you're reading this, I've finally up and gone to that big fishing hole in the sky. Don't roll your eyes, I know you are. But a man can hope, can't he? There's so much I should have said while I could still look into those green eyes of yours. I should have fought harder for us. Should have trusted what we built instead of what I was born into. Should have been brave enough to choose you every single time, not just when it was easy. Remember that day at Miller's Creek when the thunderstorm caught us by surprise? We huddled under that old sycamore, soaked to the skin, and you said something I never forgot. Sometimes the universe has to wash everything clean so we can see what matters. I see clearly now, Ellie. Too late for us, maybe, but not too late for you. The house is yours, because it always should have been our haven, not another battleground for Mother's approval. The money is yours, because I know you'll do something beautiful with it. That garden therapy program for kids you always dreamed about, maybe." A sob escaped Eleanor's throat. She'd mentioned that dream exactly once, years ago, over midnight coffee when she couldn't sleep. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," the letter continued. "I'm asking for something harder. That you don't let my failures define your future. Don't let bitterness take root like kudzu on a fence post. It'll choke everything beautiful if you let it. There's a deed in the bottom of this box to that piece of land out by Hummingbird Ridge. You know the one, with the creek running through it and those wild blackberries you love. I bought it 3 years ago, planning to surprise you for our anniversary. Then everything went sideways, and it just sat there, waiting for a purpose. Give it one, Ellie. Build something that matters. Plant things that grow. Heal in the way only you know how, with dirt under your fingernails and the sun on your face. I loved you imperfectly, but completely. Even when we were apart, you were the star I set my compass by. Always yours, Jamie." The nickname she'd given him on their second date, when he'd confessed he'd always hated being called James, but his mother insisted on it. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, feeling her heart fracture and mend simultaneously, like pottery repaired with gold in the broken places. And that's when Martha did the most unexpected thing. She rose from her chair, shoulders slumped in a way Eleanor had never seen before, and walked over to Eleanor's seat. Without a word, she placed a small blue box in Eleanor's lap. "I was wrong," Martha said, her voice brittle as old bones. "About everything. About you." Eleanor stared at the box, then at her mother-in-law's face, lined with age and grief, and now, remorse. 27 letters. 27 pieces of her heart, captured but never delivered. "I can't change what I did," Martha continued. "Lord knows I would if I could. Watching him die, knowing what I'd done." She trailed off, her composed facade crumbling like dust in a drought. Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Martha's sisters exchanged glances. Mr. Bartlett suddenly became very interested in reorganizing papers on his desk, offering the women a semblance of privacy in the crowded room. "He loved you until his last breath," Martha said, "kept your picture by his bed, called for you in his sleep." Eleanor hadn't known that. She'd visited daily, but always left before evening, giving Martha her time with her son, thinking it the decent thing to do. "I should have called you that last night," Martha whispered. "He asked for you." A memory surfaced in Eleanor's mind, sharp as broken glass, the phone ringing at 3:17 Team, her fumbling for it in the dark. But by the time she reached it, the ringing had stopped. She'd checked the caller ID, Blackwood M, and assumed Martha had dialed by mistake. She'd rolled over and gone back to sleep. By morning, James was gone. "You called me," Eleanor said slowly, the realization spreading through her like cold water. "That night, you called but hung up." Martha nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I couldn't bring myself to. I thought I should be enough. His mother, I thought. You thought you still came first," Eleanor finished for her. It wasn't a question. The truth hung between them, ugly and raw as a fresh wound. Mr. Bartlett cleared his throat. There are some documents that need signing, he said gently. Perhaps we could continue with the formal proceedings. But Eleanor wasn't ready to move on. 20 years of swallowing her words around this woman, of making herself small, of second-guessing her worth. It all rose up like floodwaters against a straining dam. You stole more than letters from us, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. You stole time, healing, a goodbye I can never get back. Martha flinched as if physically struck. I know, she whispered. I don't know if I can forgive you, Eleanor continued, surprising herself with her honesty. Not today. Maybe not ever. Martha nodded, accepting this like a sentence. But, Eleanor added after a long moment, James wanted me to build something that matters. And I can't do that on a foundation of hate. She stood up, gathering her purse and the wooden box with James's letter. The blue box of her own letters she left untouched in her chair. Those words belonged to a different Eleanor, one who still believed her marriage could be saved, who didn't know the full truth about her mother-in-law's interference. I'll come by next week, she told Martha, to talk about James, to share memories, the good ones. He'd want that. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close. But it was a tiny seed planted in scorched earth. Whether anything would grow from it remained to be seen. Mr. Bartlett watched this exchange with wise old eyes that had witnessed 50 years of family drama in this very office. The papers can wait another day, he said, closing the folder. Some things are more important than legal formalities. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the ridge overlooking her newly cleared land. The spring sunshine warmed her face as she surveyed the progress, raised garden beds taking shape. The foundation poured for a small teaching pavilion. Wildflower seeds scattered along the creek banks. You were right about this place, Luke said, coming to stand beside her. He'd been helping with the heavy work, bringing his tractor over on weekends. It's got good energy, like it's been waiting for something worthwhile. Eleanor smiled. That's exactly what James would have said. A car door slammed in the distance, and Eleanor turned to see Martha making her way carefully up the path, a flat of seedlings balanced in her arms. Their relationship remained complicated, a delicate dance of grief, regret, and cautious rebuilding. Martha had been the one to suggest the name for Eleanor's project, the Blackwood Jenkins Memorial Gardens, a joining of names that had never really been joined in life. I brought those lavender plants you mentioned, Martha called, and some lemon balm. It's good for anxiety. At least that's what the girl at the nursery said. Eleanor took the tray, their fingers brushing briefly. Thank you. They'll go nicely by the meditation space. We could use help with the herb garden, Eleanor said finally, and someone needs to teach those kids coming from the community center. I was never good at explaining things the way you are. It was an olive branch, not full forgiveness, but Martha's eyes filled with tears all the same. I'd like that, she said simply. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Eleanor walked Martha back to her car. The older woman paused before getting in, her hand on the door. He chose well, she said, looking directly at Eleanor. I was too stubborn to see it then. I'm sorry it took losing him to make me understand. Eleanor nodded, accepting the words for what they were. Not enough, but something, a beginning. She watched Martha's car disappear down the long driveway, then turned back to her land, because it was hers now, truly hers in a way the Blackwood house had never been. Here she was building something that belonged to no family legacy except the one she chose to create. In her pocket, her fingers closed around the heart-shaped stone. She would place it at the entrance to the garden, she decided. A reminder that broken things could become beautiful in new ways, that grief could be transformed into growth, and that sometimes the universe really did wash everything clean so you could see what mattered.